Just to acknowledge the traditional owners here and to pass on the greetings of the tangata whenua where I'm from, which is Tainui tribe. Thank Janet and to Nathan and the other people who invited me to speak and given me their trust for this talk. I'm a New Zealander, and even for New Zealanders I speak fast and occasionally mumble. So I will rely on the friends that I have in the audience to remind me and go. Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it, Amanda. Good. Yeah. So my talk today is, I really want to talk to you a little bit about what do we mean by patient safety. So I'm a clinician. I'm employed full-time as a clinician. I'm seconded to the Health Quality Safety Commission. So my work is grounded in Middlemore Hospital, which serves a place with lots of deprivation, high load. It's one of the busier EDs in Australasia. The ICU is the ICU that dealt with the Whakaari eruption. We are a place which is always churning. It's a very busy kind of place. But working in that kind of place and then working in the national policy space gives me some insights into a bit about the system as a whole, but it is not truth, it's just my perspective, and I'd like to share that with you today. So we live in interesting times. About 5 and a bit years ago, we had 2019, which for us involved the first major terrorist incident in Christchurch, a large unanticipated eruption with many people inside a crater when it went off, and a small little thing called a pandemic just as we were getting over the eruption. So it was an interesting time. And I think we continue to remain in interesting times. And for many of us looking at healthcare systems at the moment, we see this kind of polycrisis, this feeling that the system is increasingly ragged around the edges. We see things like workforce shortages in the setting of the pandemic, increasing recognition of healthcare, but also problems with the workforce and how many people we're going to need. We see that the performance of the system has suddenly changed, with people being unable to access selective care from the backlog of COVID, but lots of problems with that. We see the re-emergence of some old problems that we had thought we had fixed, like ED wait times. We see the widening of health inequities despite the renewed focus that we have, and we are faced with some new things coming down the line, as we talked about with AI. How will it shape us? How will we shape it? And in the setting of all this is this feeling of, ever since the GFC, to be honest, probably, but particularly post-COVID, this financial constraint that we are all being faced with. And I think we are seeing now this big push to reduce money, and we're seeing New Zealanders focus on the front line, getting rid of the back office, and we are seeing quality as becoming less of a priority, and the productive and efficiency demands of the system are increasing. And in the middle of all this crisis, I was really struck by this recent report. This is the Darzi report from the NHS, which talks about these problems as focused on the NHS. And it basically says the system is in critical condition. Everything's kind of going off, no one can access care, 14,000 people are dying a year in ED from waiting. And then it has this remarkable statement. There have been improvements in patient safety with more error-free care in hospitals. So we have a system collapsing, people dying in EDs, people unable to access care. And in the middle of that, the thing we call patient safety is supposedly doing really well. And it begs the question of what have we come to see as patient safety? It's patient safety as other to the realities of the system that we work in. So I want to explore a bit about that. How did we get to this point where patient safety is this little tiny constrained thing here as the system collapses? So we want to talk about the history of current safety model, examine the unintended consequences, and think about the implications for new safety models and what that might mean for the future. Can you all hear me, by the way? Great, all right. Thank you very much. We'll go forward. Right. There is a word in Māori culture called whakapapa, and whakapapa usually refers to your personal genealogy, your understanding of where you come from, but there is also a phrase that everything has a whakapapa. Everything has a way that it got to where it is. There is a history to the ideas that we have and to the way we work and the things we pay attention to. Everything has a whakapapa. So first, before we start, I'd just like to say the views I express are mine and mine alone. The mistakes are mine, the madness is mine. So it's not the official view of the Health Quality Safety Commission. And some aspects of this talk are based on the very excellent work of the late Bob Weirs and Kathleen Sutcliffe in their remarkable book, Still Not Safe. And I want to acknowledge that. So let's talk about how we got here. So for many of you who are younger than me, you will not necessarily remember the 80s and 90s. But that is kind of where our story focuses, and we go back to, I trained in Christchurch, and at the time we had in the mid-90s, we had the arrival of a very hard form of neoliberalism, where we had managers coming in, if you could run a bus company, you could run a hospital, because they were pretty much the same thing. We had the head of paediatrics telling me that, if you know anything about healthcare, you have a conflict of interest. So we kind of had this idea, don't laugh, this language is still there. We have people saying that the problem with healthcare is that it's run by health. So, this is still out there in some forms. So we had the rise of managerialism, this idea about targets, about we set a target and the system will do it and we will measure and manage that. And also in this background is some ideas about corporate governance that came out of the Cadbury report on corporate failures, which informed some of the future work about what we mean by governance as well. And this time there was also concerns about the rising healthcare costs and the quality of that, the over and under provision of healthcare, and the growing sort of sense of the outcomes and evidence-based movement, which basically said there are singular truths that we should find, we should use the best evidence, and we should do that. Healthcare is not a craft industry, it is a scientific and technical undertaking, and we should try and find ways to make things more evidence-informed, more standardised. And so we had this kind of push to standardisation around that time, probably around early 90s. And this kind of also around this time was the quality improvement, which kind of brought in some of the ideas of quality improvement. I think we were going for Deming, we kind of brought in Taylor, unfortunately. Right, we're going to click forward. So medical error first raised its head as our model, and I've put quotes around medical error, but it wasn't actually in quotes. So in Human Factors, the original paper was on pilot error by Shapani, and it included quotes. It said pilot error, because it talked about this idea that what seemed like error is not actually error. But we didn't do that. We kind of just we took away the quotes and we said medical error. And so when we look back to these original papers, which is the Harvard Medical Practitioners Part 2, the study Part 2, this is kind of where the phrase of medical error first came about. And it's really interesting when you look at the methodology now, and it says that basically an adverse event was something where they could reasonably avoid this error. A performance of a mistake in performance or thought. Sorry, I'm getting old eyes. The other thing was we talked about negligence, which was failure to meet a reasonable standard of care. And remember, this is in the setting of our clinical practice guidelines. So it became pretty clear if there was a practice guideline, you didn't follow it, you hadn't met the reasonable standard of care. And so that's about 97, I think it was, around there, 87. I can't remember, sorry. I can't see the reference either. So then, as we all know, To Err Is Human came out, and that was really the start of the patient safety movement as a sort of social movement. So we had this combination of high-profile cases in the media, a push to rising malpractice costs, which is a big part of it in the American system, which came from, and then there's retrospective case reviews highlighting the problem of medical error. And this kind of generated a sense of outrage, and it hit the media like it really hadn't at the time the papers came out. And there was this large sort of push to deal with this problem. You hear the great lines about 98,000 people are dying a year from medical error. It's kind of like one of the top reasons why people die. It's more common in car crashes. Everyone goes in hospital and dies. It became a very big thing. And they came out with the moonshot, which was to reduce medical error by 50% in 5 years. And they really kind of looked at the models and tools that were relevant in that time. And so a lot of what we see even now in the updated London Protocol is really based around James Reason's work on Swiss cheese. So the essential safety model has not really changed from the 97 version of Swiss cheese. So this is from the original book, which is called the Managing the Risk of Organisational Accidents. And when you go through that book, it talks about all the different subcultures from safety culture. It talks about all the things that we are doing now. And we are essentially locked into this 1997 model. Most of you will recognise this instead, which moved away from unsafe acts and latent conditions to really talking about active failures and latent conditions. Now, one of the things is that we kind of took on the model, but we kind of also didn't. We vastly misinterpreted what that meant. And I think when we talk about that, it's very clear, and part of it comes from this. When I look at this, I see an accident line. I see a sequence of failures at multiple levels that inevitably traject onto a hazard and therefore into an outcome. It is a pseudo-linear model. Does that make sense? It also, we think those slices of cheese are there and we just need to find them and it's okay, and they're not changing at all. And when you go back and read Reason, none of that's true. So just to highlight that I'm not blaming James Reason for this. He recently passed away and I'm certainly not going to kick him while he's down. That came out wrong, sorry. Like his thinking is really great, but what we have taken from it is not necessarily what he meant. This is not keeping up with my brain, sorry. Miranda understands. When we think about the underpinning safety model, which is part of this, it's really about that. These are kind of some of the taken for granted assumptions on what we've been doing in safety. The system, if it functions as it's meant to be, it will be safe. It will be well protected from hazards, nothing bad will happen. It's intrinsically safe if it works as it's meant to. Accidents arise through the interactions of active failures and latent conditions. These errors in the system, either at the front line or management or design, should be made visible through reporting, and both errors and solutions can be identified through rigorous analysis, and successful solutions will prevent recurrence of the same event. Does that seem like a fair summary? Great? Yeah, maybe. So in some ways that kind of model is, and when you think about it, it's not actually how it works, by the way, but it's actually a bit about how we presume the system might work. And in this model, we talk about safety 1 and 2, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that to make sure we're very clear on what we mean by that. The safety 1 model is not actually a model that we focus on what goes wrong. The key part of safety 1 is that there are different reasons why things have an unintended bad outcome than the reason why things have a good outcome. Okay, there are special causes of failure. There are special things that happen. So this model basically says if everything functions as it should, you should have acceptable outcomes. And there is only when we find the holes in the cheese or someone doesn't do what they're meant to that we will end up with a problem. The system is intrinsically safe, but there's something that's not quite right in it, and that's what leads to failure. Okay, special reasons why things go wrong, special reasons why things go right. Okay, system intrinsically safe, let down by things that are unanticipated, not intentional, but why things go wrong. And remembering at this time, we also had brought in the industrial processes, and I talked about this, but this was quite a rational thing, was that we were thinking about healthcare now less as a craft industry and more as an industrial kind of process, as an organisation or an industry of its own. And we brought on board a lot of the tools. And unfortunately, a lot of what we looked at was really, at that time, was really focused on efficiency, health productivity. And luckily, that's no longer in the news. We're not talking about health productivity or doing more with less. But a lot of that was really also brought in with a misunderstanding of lean, which was essentially, we had sometimes brought in about minimising variation, reducing waste, a focus on standards and procedures, and reducing our costs through efficiency. And it kind of had this mark of an industrial kind of approach to it. And again, not what Deming intended, not used in the way that Deming intended at all. But I think has been our experience of healthcare, sometimes quality improvement in a lot of places, not all. But this idea about that we can think about our processes of this happens and this happens, and is kind of work as imagined by people who don't do it. People come to ED, they get triaged, they get seen by a doctor who makes the right diagnosis if they're any good, and they get the right treatment, they get better. Work as imagined. It's really interesting when you go back to the original paper, the places that had the most negligence were aged care and ED. And there's something about those in terms of complexity that might explain why that was. But as imagined, we kind of couldn't really understand that. Right, so the aim of safety, not just in healthcare at that time, but in many industries, is really this idea about that as few things as possible go wrong, LUP, as low as reasonably possible. And that's kind of been the model that's driven us. With incidents, it's pretty easy. You have an incident, something bad happens, and because it's a special thing, we need to pay attention to it. So we will go back and review those cases, we will analyse, look for the holes at different levels, and we will address those errors. We will put in some more layers, so any of you who have been involved in some of these, we often add in another checklist, another thing you have to fill in, another check, we will add something else in as another defence in depth, another slice of cheese. We will make sure that people are compliant through education training, write another checklist maybe, and we will try and reduce the variation so people don't do that thing again. And if you think about it, it's really a model of industrial safety, focused on outputs, how much activity are we doing. Safety is explained by the reliability of the components at different levels. The staff do what they're meant to, the procedures are well matched, we can design our systems to be highly reliable and things will happen the right way. Our focus in safety has often been on bureaucratic constraint. How do we make sure the system does what it's meant to do? Often when you talk to staff, this explains why people sometimes feel that they're components of the system. I just turn up, I do my job, I do the things I'm meant to do. Or as the product of the system. When you talk to patients, they feel like I'm told to come to clinic, I do this, I do, I'm on the travelator going through the system. I'm not the reason for the system, I'm just the product passing through it. And one of the unintended consequences also that it has a transmissive model of communication. We would need you to do this, make sure you do that. And I think we sometimes do that both with our staff, but particularly with our patients. Turn up to clinic, take your medications, do what you're meant to do. We don't reverse that around and think about some other things that might be in that. All right, I'm not saying that's how it should be, I'm not saying that's how it is everywhere, and I'm sure Victoria is a great exception. And I want to put that out there, thank you, sorry. And I guess one of the things I've noticed looking at the patient safety movement is at 5 years we went, early days it's okay. 10 years, we almost there's some positive signs that we'll get there really soon. At 15 years everyone started going, this isn't working, we need to think again. And so that when you look at the 2015 kind of literature, everyone's starting to say these models aren't working. The things we had thought we would do are not happening in the way we thought they would. We are talking about the same things, we are seeing the same problems. What we are doing is not actually working. And recently they repeated the Harvard medical study, the same methodology, and found exactly the same thing. They found the same adverse events in the same places, pretty much the same rates, if not higher. So I kind of think maybe it's not working, we should think about why that is on a different level. So when we think about some of the unintended consequences, we're focused on a proceduralised approach to safety. Safety is other to normal work. There's a safety department, they do safety stuff. The quality is out here. Oh, they're turning up to audit my hand hygiene, or they're coming to do a project, or they're coming to talk to us. It's out there. It's something that's separate. Often our focus, unfortunately, in bureaucratic systems become on meeting the needs of the system rather than the system meeting our needs. So a bureaucratic closure, so I'll go backwards. So how many adverse events have we signed off? How many recommendations have we finished? We are closing off our bureaucratic needs rather than asking ourselves, are we learning anything? We often involve ourselves in what's called rituals of verification, a great book called The Audit Society, where we audit what's going on to make sure that we have fixed the problem and we can prove it to you. And another unintended consequence is we often have what's called bureaucratic entrepreneurialism. The answer to the problems of the system are always more bureaucracy, another rule, another list. In my organisation we have 2,247 policies, procedures and guidelines. I think about a huge percent have been opened, but less than 5 times, including by the author. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be there, I'm just saying if they're not being read, what purpose are they serving? So let's have a look at some of the other things. Follow the policy and everything will be okay. James Reason talks about this in 1997. He says this is it says the scope of regulated action. As you have more events and the history of the system changes, we add in more and more constraints. But if we look at what's required to do the job, sometimes we actually overly constrain the system, where it actually becomes impossible to do the job without breaching these constraints that are on you. And when the bad thing happens, then we say, well, you didn't follow the rule, rather than asking, was the rule followable in that situation? And sometimes we actually make usual work harder, and we introduce new complexities into the work we do. We focus very much on measurement. The quote from Deming is, and I feel bad calling this, but I'm going to anyway, is that Deming said, it is a fallacy to say that you cannot manage what you can't measure. He said it's a costly mistake. And he said there are some things that we can't measure that we have to still manage. And I think one of the things is when we talk about safety data, is thinking about what are we measuring, who are we measuring it for, and what use does it have, and who gets to decide what it means. And very often the metrics that we collect may not be related to the thing we're trying to do, which is the experiences and quality of care that the patients actually have. We also have a problem with our outcome focus. If a bad thing ends up with a SAC1 and a patient dies, then we will put huge resource into it. If it's something that happens 30 times, maybe not so much. And I think we have these ideas of outcome and probability, but we assume that the worse the outcome, the more learning there is. Okay, so we will put a lot into harm events or near misses, but we won't put any into about how is risk changing on a day-to-day basis until it causes an event. And in adverse event space, we often have this illusion of learning, and I say this, and this is a really important part of this. Our understanding of events is coloured by both hindsight and outcome bias. The act of looking back creates an orderliness to the timelines and to the actions that is not there at the time. Our understanding of the outcome that we have shapes how we interpret behaviour. Okay? And this is well researched, and when they look at it, and even if I tell you about hindsight and outcome bias, you are still You still have that. It's just how we're wired. And so when we look back at those original papers about judging whether something was an adverse event and then working out whether it was negligent, we start to see that they have inadequately dealt with the ideas of hindsight and outcome bias and deciding what it is we're talking about. And I think that still continues today. When we start with an action review, going with an adverse event review, we start from after an event and we look back. And what we see is a series of choices that inevitably led to a bad outcome. Okay? When you do a timeline, when you do these things, they create a sense of order to the timeliness of what happened. That creates a story that is maybe not actually what was going on at the time. And what it creates is a sense of creeping determinism. The idea that this was always going to happen based on the things they did. And we see this in our medical defence literature or case reports. This happened, this happened, this happened, and there was a bad outcome. And there's a great paper by Deb de Bono who described a day on a ward for nursing staff. All these things were going on, it was all crazy, and at the end of the day what happened was they went home. And you realise that what we're talking about is often a normal day, but we interpret it differently based on, and then this bad thing happened. And so we end up, all we end up doing is saying we know more now than they did then. And we have this illusion that we have learnt something. Part of this is also a fundamental attribution error. Although we talk about system issues, there is one of the cognitive biases, unfortunately, is about that we tend to overestimate the dispositional factors, the things about people, their personalities, decisions, behaviours and things, and we overestimate that, and we tend to underestimate the situational factors. And so we are insufficiently attentive to the complex environment in which patient safety problems arise. We are drawn to the individual. We may smile and we may say we're blame-free and we may look at system issues, but we are biased to consider them what goes on and as to what they've done. And so we often hear that, could someone in that same situation make that same choice? No, I probably wouldn't have. And when we do that, we haven't really understood anything. We haven't understood why it made sense. Click. And one of the consequences of this is that we very often end up talking about what didn't happen. And you will see this in reports. Should, would, could have, if only, they should have done this. And that agentic language is written in many of our reports. It is always there. We end up talking about what didn't happen rather than trying to understand and explain what did. And that is a real problem with the way that we use language. The other thing that was very clear from looking at the literature and in my master's thesis was basically looking at what holds us in this model and interviewing people was the messiness of everyday care is often not in there. The messiness of information, how it's changing, what's going on, is often missing in these tidy reports that we write. And the experience of those who've been harmed, both patients, families, and healthcare workers, is not really addressed in a lot of our reports. We may think that we are meeting their needs by giving them a report to review, but we haven't usually asked them what their needs actually are. We haven't involved them in saying, what do you need from this? We assume that they want an explanation and they will move on from the accident. And in Māori, they don't talk about that. They don't say you move on, you get over something. That's part of your story now. It's part of the story for you, for your family, and it's about how do we restore that relationship with that understanding that that story is still there. The other thing that's very, very clear, and this is part of the problem I think we have with our system performance, is that we are missing many layers when we think about it. So it's a delight to hear that there's an organisation that's able to look at those upper layers. But very often when we do reports, there is an invisibility to the way that things are shaped beyond the sort of the person and the organisation, the department, whatever, in terms of what else is going on. So we see two things. We see the influence of funding, policy and structural relationships between institutions and the organisation, or between regulators or the medico-legal system. That's usually missing. And also that there is an inability to escalate concerns even when they are visible. So we did a review of all the adverse events for maternity mortality, and when we looked at it, what came back was that people need more training and CTGs are really hard. I didn't see anything about primary and secondary care interfaces, the politics of obstetric funding and midwifery, power relationships, the uncertainty of and the tension between a normal delivery and making sure things are safe. These things were invisible in our reports. So when we try and aggregate these reports and try and escalate them, all we get is a whole lot of this focus on down here. And we end up with the same numbers. We haven't actually thought about why or what's going on and what does that tell us. And there's a lovely thing here. It says, Problems that did not have a feasible short-term solution were rarely addressed in action plans, particularly acute factors related to long-term resource constraints. So we will not go there because we can't change it. And I think SMART's been part of that. I want something that I can focus on and I can measure it and I can make sure it's sorted and I can do an audit on. And you go, what's within my control and what can I fix and what can I measure? And that will drive your attention to certain kinds of problems and certain kinds of solutions. This is a really lovely paper which I recommend by Nicolini and Waring. And it talks about, this is about root cause analysis, but by that they don't mean the technique of root cause analysis, they mean the technique of retrospective review. And it talks about what is the role of an adverse event review. And we say it's learning, but often it's not. Often it's part of governance. And often it's about this kind of trying to restore a sense that all is well, that we have fixed this problem, that we are a legitimate organisation, that we are okay, we are safe, and we can assure you that things are all good. So it's almost a restoration of our sense of self, of removing the uncertainty and the bad things that happen. And what that drives, unfortunately, is a focus on the content, appearance, language, and recommendations of the report. Is it written the right way? Does it do the right things? Is it on a certain way? Does it have a certain form? And in some ways, when you look at that from a sociology lens, it says, are we producing a set of auditable recommendations? I'm not saying that's how it is for everyone, but I'm saying that is something that we do see in some places. So the end result of this is that we kind of pay attention to certain kinds of problems and we look at them with certain lenses and we have certain acceptable solutions. And in theory, this is actually a form of what you look for is what you see. You know, what is a socially acceptable way of doing this, what is a socially acceptable cause, and what is something that I can have control over. And what it is it's also a form of structural secrecy. It means that information can't flow in the way that we would normally expect. And so this is a way of thinking about the approaches we're taking are basically meaning that we're seeing some kinds of problems, but we are completely blind to other kinds of problems. And I think this is part of the explanation about why we are having system issues right now, is that we have our tools make us blind. That's the health workforce at the moment. There's a great quote from Brené Brown, I'm not above sort of embracing my vulnerability. When we fix the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, the problems continue to happen. It's costly and demoralising. And I kind of think that captures a lot of where we're at right now. So let's get back to the central problem, and I'm mindful of time. Talking fast, good, great, all right, okay, good, thank you, Janet. A lot of our approaches to industrial systems are based on the idea of complicated systems, decomposable systems that we can pull apart, we can upgrade the piece or whatever, do more training, or we're going to fix this quality improvement thing here, and when we put it back in, everything else will be unchanged. So it's an idea of a complicated system. But healthcare is really not that, it is a complex system. So let's talk about systems in general. A system isn't just a collection of things. For those of you interested in systems thinking, this is the book. It's a fabulous book by Donella Meadows. And there's three things: elements, interconnection, and function or purpose. One of the things we often hear about, so do you want to take a photo? Good. Click. Great, thank you. One of the things we often hear about is that when we take a systems lens where, is it the system or the people? When we focus on the system, we're not talking about personal accountability or things like that. It's not that. Human factors is all about people in systems, understanding people within the systems in which they work. Those may be their work systems, their environment, their tasks, the technology, the organisation, or it may be the socio-cultural systems, the things that inform what we pay attention to, the different needs across different institutions. In complex systems, it's not about the component reliability. It's not about how well you are trained or how things go on. It is about the interaction between these different elements within our systems. And so the focus of that means that we need to think about the relationships. So at one level between the people who co-create care, but also between people and their work systems, and also the relationships between different institutions. The other bit with complex systems is that the whole is other than the parts. We often hear the whole is greater than the parts, the sum is greater than the parts. That's not the quote. The quote is the whole is other than the parts. It has a different nature, there's something different about the whole of a thing than there is about a parts. We all have organs, hopefully, but who we are as people is not explained by the functioning of our organs, same as any system. And so the unit of analysis must be the system as a whole, thinking about what are we going to look at, how do we understand this. And particularly for when we're thinking about dynamic systems, then we need to think about the realities of medical work. So we're in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous kind of work. We talk about the complexity of work, but do we really understand what that means? I'll share the slides. Would that be easier? Because then people don't have to, yeah. And in dynamic systems which are constantly changing and interacting, basically outcomes are emergent, not resultant. It's not a causal chain of this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's things came together in unexpected ways and created something. So it's less a Swiss cheese and more of a perfect storm. Does that make sense? Right. So when we understand that's about complexity, then we start to understand a bit about healthcare differently. And I won't go into the whole safety science about normal accidents and HRO and things, but basically what we've come to realise in safety science now is that a lot of what we're doing is that we're not sort of defending the safety of the system, we are creating the safety of the system by our ability to recognise conditions and respond to those, to deal with the flood of people coming through, or to manage a list, or to meet the needs of this person who needs you here. We are constantly making trade-offs about how efficient to be and how thorough to be. Is it efficient enough and safe enough? We are making these trade-offs all the time. And the difficulty is that work is often invisible. We don't pay attention to it. It's going on all the time, but there's this idea of the law of fluency, that well-adapted work, the work you do every day, is actually very difficult to make sense of for someone who doesn't understand what you're doing. It looks like you're just, you see someone, you triage them, off we go. Like we're not making sense of actually that work that expertise is brought to bear on. And so this explains a bit about why work is done. The realities of clinical work are not the same linear things that we thought of our industrial model. They're very messy and dynamic because we're responding to messy and dynamic conditions. So in this new model of safety, basically it says that safety is not something that is there normally. Safety is something that's created every day. Okay? The key thing about safety 2, so safety 2 is often portrayed as learning from what goes well. People heard that? That's not it. It's really not it. But it's about learning from what goes. Okay, so it's about understanding how, the key thing with safety 2 is it says it's a loss of special causes of failure. It says things that normally work are also the things that sometimes don't when conditions change. So we create safety every day, and sometimes the same things we do that create safety can create risk. Okay, so the reason things go wrong, the reason things go well are often very linked. So kind of a hard concept, but that is the central bit about this model. It says it's the loss of special reasons why things go wrong. And it explains our system more about emergence or resonance, about normal variability coming together in unexpected ways. So things we normally do that normally work suddenly don't, because conditions have changed. And this model of safety is really interesting. It says the system only succeeds because people and teams are able to adjust to meet the conditions of work. An implication of this is really interesting. It says the problem is complexity, and your answer is actually the people that you employ. They're not to be constrained and to be treated like a component and replaced by AI or automated or standardized as much as possible. They are the bit that allows you to deal with dynamic conditions. They are the bits who can judge when conditions are changing. And so it values the staff in a way that's quite different. So the new aim of safety in this model says, how do we create the conditions where as much as possible goes right? As much as possible delivers a good outcome. And it is an alignment between normal work about supporting the conditions of work to ensure that it goes really well, to ensure that we can provide good care. How are we working to provide the conditions, supporting the adaptive space that people do when they are creating good care? And it aligns quality and safety work, aligns the operational needs with our sense of safety. All right, let's make this a bit more practical because that's often tricky. When you change your perspective, you see different things. So when we think about this kind of model, it explains some of the successes we've had and also some of the problems we're facing. So when we think about the CLAD pack, it's less about for central line infections. There's a great book called The Checklist Manifesto. The reason we have CLADs are reduced is because of the checklist. It's not. We watched our staff, they don't use the checklist, but our rate went down. It's not that. It's the pack. We made it easy for people to go and use stuff. We designed it to support the realities of work. Everything's there, it's great. When we think about surgical briefings, it's not the checklist, it's how you use it. The checklist is an artifact of a team coming together to talk about the risks that we see ahead. So that explains why if you introduce it where people are just doing it as a tick, it doesn't work. It's not the checklist. The checklist is an artifact of a team coming together. it also helps us to think about, well, how do we build the adaptive capacity of teams? So this is from the military, and talking to Robin, we were talking about the fact that this is a military model of leadership, and thinking. This is from the military in Iraq. It says, in complex environments, resilience, the ability to change, to adapt to changing conditions, is often why you have success. Well, even the most brilliantly engineered fixed solutions are often insufficient or counterproductive. Okay, we need to match the nature of our work with how we design and think about our systems. And we've seen this. If you look at the Ghafferi paper, this is a paper most people know this as Failure to Rescue, which is a really interesting title. What I'd call it is resilient performance. And it basically says that when you look at the reason people die after surgery, is it's not because there are more complications, it's about whether the system can recognise and respond to changing conditions for those people. So places that have systems in place to recognise and respond to change, to unanticipated complications, are the ones the mortality is lower. And so we can actually frame that paper less as about failure to rescue and more about the ability to adapt. There are limits to adaptive capacity, and I think one of the things we're seeing at the moment is that we have used up a lot of our adaptive capacity during COVID. And this is the idea that we can cope for a while and then things become increasingly brittle and things can then change in non-linear ways. For our example, we have seen ED presentations have gone up by 10%, but system performance has changed markedly. It's just tipped everything slightly over the edge. And I think it's the same with a lot of places. Not a big change, but a big deterioration in the way that we're functioning. And I think we've used up a lot of our adaptive capacity during COVID. And COVID's been one of the biggest examples of resilient kind of principles worldwide. When we think about our ability to change, we saw an unleashing of the adaptive capacity of teams to think new things about how they worked. This unleashing of what was originally in Lean about the front line as a resource for change. Ironically, we saw this idea of unleashing what was going on, but we also saw that there were limits to our ability to cope, to adapt, and that when we reached those limits, that the system performance changed markedly. So if you look here, down the bottom is ANZICs for ICU. That's the mortality if you had COVID in ICU, a little red dot down the bottom. And if you look at the top, sort of above the line on the right-hand side is the UK data. Now they have a very similar ICU system, but their mortality was much higher. That is not to do with the treatments, the things they were doing. It is to do with the fact the system overloaded and their adaptive capacity went down and the performance deteriorated. So there are limits to our adaptive capacity. And I think this is one of the things we're seeing. Another great paper is Going Solid by Jens Rasmussen and Richard Cook, the late Richard Cook, which talks about the fact that when you exhaust your adaptive capacity, essentially the system starts to lock up. It becomes more tightly coupled. So I can't admit a patient till I discharge a patient. That the system becomes increasingly locked up and we see that risk changes and it becomes harder to defend against. And I think when we look at things like ambulance ramping or ED spiking, that's a recognition that the system is under some conditions going solid. And I think one of the things that's also really important is that we are loading a lot of our adaptive needs on the front line. We've loaded them up and we haven't thought about how do we actually support them in that adaptive work. All right. Let's talk about what we might do differently. Time-wise, we're okay. Yeah, good. Talk faster. There's another great Māori phrase that says ka mua ka muri, looking back in order to move forward. And they talk about this idea that we move into the future while looking to the past. And when I was a kid, I was like, why don't they just fall over? But I kind of understand it now, which is more about like being aware of what shapes you and using that understanding to think about the future. And that's part of what I'm hoping from today, is if we understand our past, we can think about where to from here. So, as I said, Safety 2 is not about learning from what goes well. It is not the same as appreciative inquiry. It is not the same as learning from excellence, although I applaud those programs. It is about understanding all outcomes as the outcomes from the same system. The reason you have an awesome system that delivers heaps of hip operations and does really good surgery and sees people and follows things is the same reason why sometimes it will cause problems. They are not different systems. And so the focus is on all outcomes of a system. So there is no Safety 3, because we're talking about all things. So just to be really clear, it's not about, we can't ignore we can't ignore adverse events, we can't ignore those things. We are thinking of those as particular iterations of the same system. Particular things the system has done under some conditions. Right, so some questions. So the first principle I would put to you guys is we need to move to thinking about supporting the conditions for success, and that's part of this conference. Are we trying to make failure less likely by putting in place more and more barriers or defences to maintain safety? Or are we trying to create the conditions where success is more likely? Are we understanding the realities of work is done, and are we doing things that support that? And that really means that we have to be focused on work as done. We cannot have this idea about, if I read the procedures and policies, I understand the hospital, I understand how things work. You need to go and see people, to understand their teams, their equipment, their space, their culture, what's going on. Otherwise, you will not understand what's happening. This also means that that our frontline staff are actually a key resource. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about a hand hygiene thing, but you actually, the frontline staff will give you the answers you need if you ask them and go and spend time. But it involves a couple of things. One is you have to be genuinely curious about the realities of work. And the second thing is that people have to be safe. They have to be willing to be vulnerable to share and discuss the realities of work. And that's actually sometimes harder than it sounds. You can say that we believe in psychological safety and I empower you to speak up, but that ain't cutting it. It's historically informed. Next time you say, well, we've just got your protocol, you're in trouble, sorry. You have to have long-term relationships of trust. It's not something you can do without that. We had this with our hand hygiene staff. They used to come along and do audits, and they were kind of the Gestapo turns up and everyone washes their hands. And now when they turn up, because we've changed our model, they turn up and they go, great, can I ask you a question? We've got this thing here. How would I do that? What would happen? So we have relationships trust where it's a resource, not as someone coming to check I'm doing the right things. The other thing is that patients and families are also a resource. And I think one of the problems with our industrial models is that we haven't accounted for the differentiated needs of our patients and families, consumers' families. And I think that's because what we found with COVID was if you met the assumptions of the system as designed, the COVID system, you did pretty well. But the further you were away from those design assumptions, so for Māori, Pacific, disability, refugee, non-English speaking, then the worse that system worked for you. And I think that's the same with a lot of the way we design at the moment, is we design something really awesome, but only for certain assumptions. So they are active participants in co-creating care. That we need to see people within their systems, understand differentiated needs, and focus on outcomes, not just activity. Does this actually something that we're doing, or are we just, are we doing an activity, or are we actually changing things here? And I think what is needed is that to understand these realities and change, and we actually need to engage with expertise. So I don't consider myself an HF practitioner. I am HF adjacent. But very often we see people, they go and do team training or they do an HF course and they are the HF expert, but they're not. I'm really sorry. We have people in the UK who are advising senior bodies who say HF is just common sense. It's not. It's like me saying ICU, it's just common sense. Off you go. It's a whole thing. And we need to be thinking differently about how to bring not only HF but also organisational research. There's a whole lot of stuff in the critical systems thinking kind of field of organisational research, or sociologists, anthropologists, engineering. We need to be bringing those in to help us because that's what worked in other places. We need an intensive approach of understanding what's going on and supporting that, rather than these extensive approaches which are basically about counting how often we have adverse events. You don't change the pig by measuring it. Second thing, we need to learn different lessons. We need to think much more about, rather than thinking about what was so unusual about this case and how do we explain this deviation from the norm, to thinking much more about what was so usual about this case. What does this tell us about the usual things that people face within their care? If you are trying to aggregate differences, it's very hard. People did this bad thing because of education, whatever, then we'll see education. And it makes it like everything is particular and you can't really think about it in general. If I say to you what's so usual about this case, what does it tell us about how risk is changing and how staff are able to meet that, that is something we can aggregate and think about where we should solve it. So we talk about what is so usual about this case and what does it tell us about what our staff are facing. So rather than sort of looking backwards, we're trying to understand how these decisions by clinicians made sense at the time. And for this, we really need to understand this idea of local rationality, that people do things that make sense to them given their goals, their understanding, and their focus of attention at that time. And for us, we have moved to a different model. We have not gone down the London protocol model. We have been working with Ivan Pupuldi, looking at the learning reviews, and we're working very closely with that, where we get away from the idea of causal chains and linearity, and we start to think much more differently about, talk to people about usual work, and then trying to make sense of events in the setting of understanding usual work. And that also means we need to think when we do this is not going back and saying, here's the protocol, here's what you did. Is actually saying, is the protocol followable? What does the gap tell us about how we understand work? About who's writing these protocols? Who are they being written for? what's going on with that. So not saying that one is right or one is wrong. You know, like people wearing rubbish bags in COVID was not awesome. It's not saying that everything people do is great, but it's trying to understand the gap between the way we design and think about our systems and the way that work is actually happening. And this, as I said, we're working with hypermobility. This is the idea that a lot of our approaches are based on a complicated system where we can analyse it. You can analyse the system and you assume it's unchanged and it's dynamic, and the same problems we find are the same systems that are there. Whereas in complex systems, it's constantly changing, and it's much more about sense making, bringing people together to understand what's going on in the system. We are trying to get people to look up and out to understand what's going on in the wider system, and I see that you guys are using Axiomaps and stuff, and it's to try and drive that attention up to understand what's going on. And one of the things we've found is to try and overcome this idea about the quick fix, the thing that we can do in front of us. And so very often we say, what's within my control, what's measurable, what's achievable, and instead we think about what can I change now, where you might do a smart target, what can I change but will take longer, and what is beyond my ability to change but needs to be made visible. And it's a much nicer way of thinking about problems because you don't have to solve everything. You can think about how do we escalate these to somewhere else. Is it quite warm in here? No, it is, okay. One of the other things we talk about with system learning is that, as I say, we very often try and meet the needs of families by giving them a report, but there is a large focus now on restorative practice, and my dear friend Jo Whaling and New Zealand is leading a lot of this work. And this is something we've incorporated into our latest adverse event policy, which really says that, you know, if you are going to have system learning, then you need to still meet the needs of people who are harmed. You may not choose to investigate every case, but you certainly need to understand what their experiences are and what they need. And it's about addressing harms, meeting their needs, restoring trust and the relationship they have with the healthcare system, and promoting healing. And there's a whole section on that with our work that we've been doing. The last one is really about how do we build adaptive capacity in our systems. And this is when we talk about this is really this idea of where resilient healthcare is at. Resilient healthcare is about our capacity to adapt to challenges and changes at different system levels to maintain high quality care. And it's not just things that might go wrong, it's also opportunities. So it's opportunity and threats. So AI, is it going to be an opportunity or a threat? Still not sure. But it's about thinking about our systems less as a machine or a factory and more about as a forest. How is it growing? How will we shape it? And so when we talk about that, very often we talk about these ideas of capacities of resilience. So how are we able to anticipate what might happen in our systems? What are we going to look for? How are we going to understand them? And what are we going to do about it? And then how do we learn from them? And this is it's sometimes hard to see, and it's something that's better to be enacted through examples, and we can talk about those. One of the key things with resilience, though, is that you cannot anticipate everything. We did not anticipate a volcano. Our national burns plan was not adequate. And so we need to be both prepared and think about the future, but also understand that surprise, things happening unexpectedly, is a big part of our systems. One of the key things is, and you would have seen this with COVID, is that you need the local responses to be able to change rapidly, to deal with the things that are happening in your communities or in your ED or wherever very quickly. But their ability to cope and respond is limited by the historical resourcing, the relationships they have and the things that they can do. Beyond that, you need to then think about different system levels that are able to adapt. Okay? Do we need to reorganise ourselves? Do we need to restructure something fundamentally? So resilience is not just something that happens at the front line, it is something throughout our whole systems. This means we can take it from the idea of an adaptive team, dealing with the differentiated needs of patients, right through to thinking about how does clinical governance recognise and respond to changing risk within our systems. It has implications for leadership in terms of the way that we lead, less about follow the rules or I empower you or I'm going to walk around, and more about how do I understand the realities of work and how do I make sure that I am balancing the creativity that I want from people and the constraint to make sure things are okay. And finally, just to talk about how does the system really learn about itself, because this is a bit that I think has been missing. This is from a lovely book called Sand Talk, which is one of the nicest books on complexity I've read. And it talks about looking beyond the things and focusing on connections, looking beyond the connections to see the patterns and finding the sites of risk to understand where you should act. And I think for us, this means really we need to move to less about these ideas of governance systems as comfort seeking. Are we safe? Can I assure you we're safe? And more about how is risk changing? What is going on? Where are we in the space of being optimized versus brittle or efficient or thorough? How are we shaping the space for adaptation? and what are the opportunities or risks that we see ahead. And I think when we look at our governance systems, we need to think less about how do we flow things up to someone who's going to sort it out, and more about how do we build the capacity of our systems to solve problems for themselves. So thinking about why is this issue unable to be solved at the lower level, what relationships or capacities are missing, and how else might we think about this. So resilient healthcare is more about outcomes, not outputs. It's about safety as the ability to meet conditions, about balancing creativity and constraint, and seeing people as the purpose, and communication as co-construction. Some final thoughts. Conditions are changing, are always changing. The last 5 years are nothing on what the next 5 years will bring. Every conference I've been to lately is talking about military things and preparation for bad things. We talk about AI, we talk about all these things that are coming. The world that we imagined the last 5 years, even though it's been chaos, is going to be changing again. And we need to think about how are we placed to adapt to that changing reality. Our models of safety shape what we see and, more importantly, what we don't, and we need to think about what we are blind to. And this changing the model, changing our understanding of systems will require collaboration and change at all levels. It is not something that can just happen with people and organisations. It needs to be thinking about what are the tools, what are the models that we're using within medico-legal systems, within the governance systems, and with explaining ourselves to the public. There you go. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Has been fun.